Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1908, when the Monongahela region of West Virginia became the setting for what locals would later call the Shadow of Black Rock Ridge. This account comes to us from fragmentary records discovered in the county archives of Tucker County, West Virginia, specifically in the once-thriving lumber town of Davis, which sits nestled among the dense hardwood forests that once blanketed the Appalachian highlands. The town of Davis had boomed since 1884, when the railroad first connected it to the outside world. By the early 1900s, logging had transformed the sleepy mountain settlement into a bustling industrial center with sawmills running day and night. Thousands of acres of virgin forest were harvested yearly, creating a landscape of stumps where ancient trees once stood. The Blackwater Lumber Company, one of many operations drawn to the region's vast timber resources, established a remote logging camp deep in the forest near Canaan Valley, some 15 miles from town. It was here, according to documents from the period, that a man named Obadiah Marsh made his mark. Marsh wasn't originally from the mountains. Company records indicate he arrived from Pennsylvania in 1906, already experienced in the lumber trade. Standing over 6 feet tall, with unusually broad shoulders, Marsh quickly gained a reputation as the most efficient sawyer in the operation. His output was nearly double that of other men. The camp foreman, Josiah Mercer, noted in his weekly reports that Marsh seemed to possess an unnatural vigor and constitution, working from sunrise until dusk without apparent fatigue. But there was something about Marsh that put the other men on edge. Even in the rough society of a logging camp where hard men did dangerous work, Marsh stood apart. He rarely spoke, never joined the card games or shared stories around the evening fire, and lived alone in a small cabin he built, separate from the bunkhouses where most men slept. The loggers, many of them local mountaineers, who'd turned to timber work as their traditional farming way of life, became untenable, kept their distance. The camp cook, Abraham Harmon, wrote in a personal letter to his sister in Elkins, "The Pennsylvania man keeps to himself in a way that ain't natural. The fellas say he talks to himself when he's out on the cutting line, not just muttering neither, but having what sounds like full conversations, though nobody's ever close enough to make out the words. And strangest of all, he don't seem to need no company. Most men get lonesome out here in the deep woods, start to hunger for town and civilized voices after a spell. Not Marsh." According to payroll records, Marsh would occasionally take his earnings and disappear for days, presumably heading into Davis, or perhaps the larger town of Thomas a few miles north. But he never caroused with the other men, or sought the usual entertainments that loggers favored when they had money in their pockets. He would simply return, often with supplies loaded on a mule, and resume his solitary existence in the woods. The trouble began in November of 1908. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, several men reported tools missing from the equipment shed. At first it seemed like carelessness, a misplaced axe here, a saw gone there. But when Mercer conducted an inventory, the losses were significant. 3 double-bit axes, a cross-cut saw, several wedges, and most concerning, the camp's only medical kit. Around this same time, another logger named Franklin Pierce disappeared. Pierce, a young man from nearby Parsons, had been working at the camp for only 2 months. His absence wasn't noted immediately, as men sometimes left without notice, especially as winter approached. But when his mother arrived at the company office in Davis asking about her son's whereabouts, Mercer conducted a search. What they found was disturbing. Pierce's few belongings remained in his bunk, including a letter he'd been writing to his mother, and a small pocket Bible inscribed with his name. His coat still hung on its peg. No man would willingly walk into the November mountains without his coat. A search party was organized, but the early winter snow had already begun to fall, obscuring any tracks or signs of the young logger's fate. It was during this search that the men made their first unsettling discovery. About 2 miles from camp, in a dense stand of hemlocks that had not yet been marked for cutting, they found what appeared to be a crude shelter built into the side of a ravine. Inside, they discovered some of the missing tools arranged in a peculiar pattern on the earthen floor. According to Mercer's report to the company headquarters, the implements were positioned in a manner suggesting some ritual purpose rather than practical use. The medical kit was also recovered, though most of its contents had been removed. Most disturbing of all, they found scraps of clothing that Pierce's mother later identified as belonging to her son. But of the young man himself, there was no sign. The county sheriff, Alden Whitaker, was summoned from Parsons to investigate. His report, preserved in the county records, indicates a thorough search of the area around the camp. The shelter appears to have been constructed with considerable skill, Whitaker wrote, utilizing techniques not commonly employed by loggers, but reminiscent of indigenous structures once found in these mountains. He also noted finding unusual markings carved into nearby trees, which he described as symbols of unknown origin and meaning. Obadiah Marsh immediately fell under suspicion. His solitary habits, his unexplained absences, and his separate dwelling all marked him as different. Moreover, he'd been seen working in the hemlock stand where the shelter was discovered, though that area wasn't part of the current cutting operation. When questioned, Marsh offered simple, direct answers that revealed little. Yes, he sometimes hunted in that area. No, he knew nothing about the missing tools or the shelter. No, he hadn't seen young Pierce on the day of his disappearance. The sheriff, having no evidence beyond suspicion, could do nothing but warn Mercer to keep an eye on the Pennsylvania man. The winter of 1908-09 was harsh in the mountains. Heavy snows isolated the logging camp for weeks at a time. As was customary, operations slowed but didn't cease entirely. The men continued to fell trees when weather permitted, dragging logs through the snow to the staging areas where they would wait for spring thaws to be transported to the mills. During these isolated months, tension grew in the camp. 2 more men vanished, Jacob Kinsey and William Garrett, both experienced loggers who had worked in the mountains for years. Neither would have abandoned their winter wages, and neither would have attempted to travel through the snow-choked mountains without preparation. Yet both disappeared without a trace, leaving their belongings behind just as Pierce had. The remaining men, now thoroughly alarmed, began to keep watch at night. They traveled in pairs even for short journeys to the outhouse or tool shed. Mercer reported that productivity suffered severely as fear spread through the camp. He requested additional security from the company headquarters, but the winter roads made bringing in more men impossible. During this period, Marsh's behavior grew increasingly erratic. The camp cook observed him standing motionless among the trees for hours in the bitter cold, as if listening. Others reported hearing strange sounds coming from his cabin at night, not quite speech, not quite song, but something in between that carried disturbingly through the still winter air. In February 1909, during a brief thaw, Sheriff Whitaker made the treacherous journey back to the camp with 2 deputies. They brought with them a man named Ezekiel Crawford, who claimed expertise in tracking and woodcraft. Crawford was known locally as a witch doctor of sorts, not a medical man, but someone versed in mountain folklore and traditional knowledge. The records indicate that Crawford spent several days examining the camp and surrounding forest. His conclusions, as recorded by Whitaker, were vague but troubling. "There's something wrong with the Pennsylvania man," he reportedly said. "He's carrying something dark inside him. I've seen it before in men who've spent too long in deep places where light don't reach." Crawford led the sheriff to several other crude shelters hidden in the forest, similar to the first but increasingly complex in their construction. In one, they discovered what appeared to be a journal written by Marsh. The contents, partially quoted in Whitaker's report, revealed a mind unraveling. "The trees speak when the wind dies," one entry read. They tell me about the old ones who lived here before. They show me how to hear the voices in the wood. Every cut of the axe releases something that's been trapped. I'm setting them free, one by one. Another passage was more disturbing. P resisted when I tried to show him. They always resist at first, but once the wood gets inside, they understand. K and G were easier. They were ready to listen. Soon there will be enough of us. The sheriff immediately ordered Marsh's arrest, but when they returned to the camp, they discovered the Pennsylvania man had vanished, along with several more tools and supplies. A search of his cabin revealed the truth of his madness. The walls were covered with the same strange symbols found carved in the trees, drawn in what appeared to be a mixture of sap and some darker substance. Under the floorboards, they found personal items belonging to the missing men: Pierce's pocket watch, Kinsey's tobacco pouch, Garrett's carved wooden pipe, but most disturbing was what they found buried behind the cabin. According to Whitaker's carefully worded report, they discovered evidence suggesting Mr. Marsh had been engaged in some manner of surgical experimentation, the nature of which decency forbids me from describing in detail. The report mentions implements fashioned from both metal and wood, showing considerable ingenuity if horrifying purpose. The search for Marsh extended through the spring thaw and into summer, but the man seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness of the Monongahela. Occasional reports came from isolated homesteads and distant logging camps of a tall, powerful man seen moving through the forest, but these sightings could never be confirmed. The Blackwater Lumber Company closed the camp permanently in April 1909, relocating the remaining men to other operations. The company records cite personnel issues and local superstition as the reasons for abandonment, though they continued logging other tracts in the region for many years after. In the summer of 1911, a surveying party mapping potential routes for a new logging railroad made a grisly discovery in a remote hollow some 20 miles from the abandoned camp. They found what appeared to be an elaborate structure built around and incorporating a massive old-growth oak. The construction utilized both conventional carpentry and strange, primitive techniques that the party's leader, an engineer named Holcomb, could not identify. According to Holcomb's report, preserved in the Tucker County Historical Society archives, the interior of this structure contained evidence of long-term habitation. They found tools, preserved food, handmade furniture, and, most disturbingly, what appeared to be a workshop area where wood and other materials had been shaped and joined in unusual ways. Holcomb wrote, "The entire construction suggests a mind both technically adept and fundamentally unsound. The precision of certain elements would challenge a master carpenter, while other aspects speak to a primitive, almost savage approach to building. Most disturbing are the numerous artifacts that appear to combine wooden components with materials of unidentifiable origin." The surveying party reported their find to authorities in Davis, but by the time a proper investigation could be mounted, the site had been destroyed by fire. Whether this was an act of nature or human intervention remains unknown. Obadiah Marsh was never found. His name appears in various official records through 1915 as the subject of bulletins to law enforcement throughout West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. After that, interest in the case seems to have waned as the more pressing concerns of World War I occupied public attention. But the legacy of what locals came to call the woodcutter of Black Rock Ridge persisted in regional folklore. For decades after, logging companies in the Monongahela region reported difficulty recruiting men to work in the area near the old Blackwater camp. Parents warned children not to venture too deep into certain parts of the forest. Hunters told stories of finding strange structures hidden among the trees, always in remote areas where the oldest growth remained. In 1932, a folklorist from West Virginia University named Margaret Prescott conducted interviews with elderly residents of Tucker County who remembered the events of 1908-09. Her notes, preserved in the university archives, record numerous local beliefs that had developed around the Marsh case. Some claimed the Pennsylvania man had discovered old Indian burial grounds and become possessed by vengeful spirits. Others suggested he had found something older and darker in the deep forest, something that had been waiting in the ancient trees since before human settlement. The most common belief was that Marsh himself was not fully human, but some manner of forest entity that had taken human form to move among the logging camps. Prescott's most intriguing interview was with a former logger named Irene Sawyer, who claimed to have worked alongside Marsh at the Blackwater camp. Sutton, then in his 70s, described Marsh as unnaturally strong and recalled how the man would sometimes press his ear against freshly cut wood as if listening to something within. He told me once that every tree holds memories, Sutton recounted, said they remember the old ones who worshipped in these woods thousands of years ago, said they remember the words and songs those people used, and if you listen close enough, the trees will teach them to you. I thought he was just touched in the head, the way some men get when they spend too much time alone in the forest. Now, I ain't so sure. Sutton also claimed that in the weeks before the disappearances began, Marsh had suffered a serious accident while felling a particularly massive oak. According to Sutton, a falling branch struck Marsh's head with enough force to split his scalp and leave him unconscious for hours. When he revived, he seemed changed, more withdrawn than before, and began to spend his nights wandering in the forest rather than sleeping. After that blow to the head, something was different in his eyes, Sutton said, like he was looking at things the rest of us couldn't see. And he started talking different too, using old words nobody understood. Some of the mountain men said he was speaking in tongues like the Holy Rollers do, but it didn't sound like any religious talk I ever heard. What Sutton described next was particularly disturbing. He claimed that in the days following Marsh's injury, several men reported finding strange wooden figurines placed outside their bunks in the morning. These small objects were intricately carved from freshly cut wood, depicting what appeared to be human forms, but with disturbing anatomical distortions, elongated limbs, twisted torsos, faces with features that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. No one admitted to making these objects, and when confronted, Marsh denied any knowledge of them. But Sutton noted that the Pennsylvania man's hands often bore fresh cuts, as if from carving tools, and he was frequently seen whittling small pieces of wood during his rare moments of rest. The figures gave the men the willies, Sutton recalled. Some threw them in the fire, others buried them far from camp. But Pierce, he kept his, said it reminded him of something from his childhood, though he couldn't say what exactly. That was just days before he went missing. The most disturbing part of Prescott's research involved a series of unsolved disappearances that continued in the region for years after Marsh vanished. Between 1910 and 1925, over a dozen people went missing in the forests of Tucker and Randolph counties. Most were solitary travelers, hunters, or trappers, men who ventured alone into the deep woods and never returned. But a few were logging camp workers, always men who worked as sawyers or axemen, those who directly cut the trees. In each case, searches found little evidence of the missing person's fates. Occasionally, investigators discovered crude shelters similar to those associated with Marsh, but never any human remains. The last documented disappearance occurred in 1925, when a timber cruiser named Lawrence Wade vanished while marking trees for cutting near the headwaters of the Blackwater River. Prescott's interviews revealed another curious pattern. In many cases, the disappearances were preceded by reports of unusual sounds in the forest, rhythmic tapping or knocking that didn't match the cadence of typical woodpecker activity, often heard at night, when most birds would be silent. Some locals came to believe that these sounds were warnings or lures, meant to draw the unwary deeper into the woods where the woodcutter waited. One particularly eerie account came from Silas Harlan, who had worked as a cook's assistant in a logging camp near Parsons in 1915. According to Harlan, a sawyer named Lester Hughes had complained for several days about hearing someone working in the woods at night when all the other men were in camp. Hughes described the sound as a steady, skilled axe stroke, but when he and others investigated, they never found anyone. A week after he first heard the chopping, Hughes didn't come back from his cutting assignment, Harlan told Prescott. The foreman sent out search parties, but all they found was his axe stuck deep in a big old oak. The handle had been removed, and the metal head was driven so far into the wood that 3 strong men couldn't pull it out. They ended up leaving it there. Harlan claimed that for years afterward, locals would occasionally see the axe head still embedded in the tree, which oddly remained alive despite what should have been a fatal wound to its trunk. Some said that during full moons, the axe head would seem to sink deeper into the wood, as if being driven by invisible hands. The historical record grows increasingly fragmented after this point. The Great Depression and then World War II diverted attention from what might otherwise have been seen as a pattern of disturbing incidents in a remote corner of Appalachia. The logging industry in the region declined as the most accessible timber was harvested, and the population of Tucker County dwindled as young people sought opportunities elsewhere. In 1951, however, there was a brief resurgence of interest in the Marsh case, following an incident at a small sawmill near the town of Hendricks. According to newspaper accounts and police reports from the time, a night watchman named Vernon Powell reported seeing a tall figure moving among the stacked lumber after hours. Thinking it was a thief, Powell confronted the intruder only to find himself face to face with what he described as a man who wasn't quite a man. In his statement to local authorities, Powell described the figure as extremely tall and gaunt, with skin that appeared to have the texture and color of weathered wood. Most disturbing, he claimed the intruder's limbs moved in unnatural ways, bending where there shouldn't be joints like branches in the wind. Powell fired his revolver at the figure, which he said made no sound but turned and moved with incredible speed into the surrounding forest. The watchman was sufficiently unsettled by the encounter that he quit his job the following day and moved away from the area entirely. Investigators found unusual scratches on several of the lumber stacks, described in the police report as not consistent with any known tool, appearing more similar to claw marks, but of unusual size and pattern. They also discovered a small wooden object left behind at the scene, a minutely detailed carving of the mill itself, accurate down to the smallest features, but with one disturbing addition: tiny human figures positioned as if being fed into the saw blade. The mill's owner recognized the similarity to local legends about the woodcutter of Black Rock Ridge and contacted Margaret Prescott, who by then had become the unofficial historian of the Marsh case. Prescott traveled to Hendricks to interview Powell and examine the carving, but her notes from this period are uncharacteristically sparse, suggesting she may have found the incident too disturbing to document fully. In her personal journal, however, she wrote, "If the stories are true and Marsh still lives, he would be at least 70 years old now. The figure Powell describes cannot be the same man, and yet the similarity to earlier accounts is striking. Perhaps what we are dealing with is not a man at all, but something that merely wore the shape of a man for a time, something that has since evolved into a form more suited to its true nature." In 1968, a graduate student in anthropology at Marshall University, Irene Sawyer, attempted to compile all available information on what she termed the Marsh phenomenon. Her unpublished thesis, Folklore and Fact: The Legend of the Monongahela Woodcutter, provides the most comprehensive academic treatment of the subject. Sawyer conducted extensive archival research and interviewed elderly residents who still remembered the stories, if not the original events. She also hiked extensively in the forests where Marsh had operated, by then largely incorporated into the Monongahela National Forest. In a journal entry dated July 15, 1968, Sawyer wrote, "Today I found something disturbing near the site of the old Blackwater camp. In a clearing not marked on any Forest Service map, there stands a circle of young oak trees, perhaps 30-40 years old, arranged with a geometric precision that cannot be natural. At the center of this circle is a stump of enormous size, likely one of the original old-growth trees harvested a century ago. Sawyer described finding unusual carvings on these trees, similar to those reported in the historical accounts of Marsh's activities. She made rubbings of several of these markings, which are included in her thesis appendix. According to a linguistic anthropologist she consulted, the symbols contained elements reminiscent of various indigenous writing systems, but do not match any known language. Most unsettling was Sawyer's final journal entry dated August 3, 1968. I've been hearing strange sounds at night for the past week, a low, rhythmic chanting from somewhere deep in the forest. The research station staff say it's just the peculiar way wind moves through this valley, but it sounds distinctly human to me. Yesterday I found another carved figure on the trail leading to my research site. It resembles the ones described in the historical accounts, a human form with distorted features and limbs. But this one is different in one disturbing respect. It bears a clear resemblance to me, down to the details of my clothing and the notebook I carry. Tomorrow I'm hiking out to the old drainage where Holcomb's survey team found that structure in 1911. The Forest Service has no record of any trail there, but I've identified what I believe to be the location on their topographic maps. There is no further entry in Sawyer's journal. According to Marshall University records, she failed to return from her research trip and was reported missing on August 12, 1968. A search and rescue operation found her campsite abandoned, her equipment and notes undisturbed. Of Irene Sawyer herself, no trace was ever found. The university subsequently shelved her thesis, and her research materials were placed in storage, where they remained largely forgotten until 1991, when a routine digitization project brought them to light again. One detail from the search for Sawyer, not included in official reports but mentioned in a letter from a rescue team member to his family, described finding an area where several trees had been freshly cut, not by chainsaw, which would have been standard practice by the 1960s, but by axe with a skill that the experienced woodsman described as almost supernatural in its precision. Near these stumps, the search team reportedly found small wood shavings arranged in a pattern that, when viewed from above, formed what appeared to be a human face. In the decades since, the forests of the Monongahela have recovered from the extensive logging of the early 20th century. Second and third growth timber now covers much of what was once stripped bare. The towns of Davis and Thomas have reinvented themselves as tourism destinations, gateways to natural attractions like Blackwater Falls State Park and Canaan Valley. Few locals now remember the story of Obadiah Marsh or the disappearances associated with him. The events, if mentioned at all, are dismissed as mountain superstition or explained away as the ordinary hazards of life in what was then a dangerous frontier of industrial logging. But deep in the forest, in areas rarely visited by hikers or hunters, local Forest Service personnel occasionally report finding unusual structures built with a combination of ancient and modern techniques. These discoveries are typically attributed to the activities of people living off the grid, perhaps hiding from the law, or simply seeking extreme isolation. In 1987, a group of environmental activists attempting to document old-growth remnants in the Monongahela found themselves inexplicably lost despite having modern topographic maps and compasses. After wandering for hours in what should have been a relatively small area, they came upon a stand of trees that seemed older than the surrounding forest. According to their account, published in an obscure environmental journal, these trees had been shaped in ways that defied natural growth patterns. Branches had been trained to grow in intricate geometric forms, and the trunks themselves bore marks of careful manipulation over many decades. Most disturbing, they reported finding what appeared to be fragments of bone and metal embedded in the wood of several trees, as if these materials had been deliberately inserted into the living tissue and then grown over. The group made hasty recordings and photographs before becoming overwhelmed by what their leader described as an intense sense of being unwelcome, of having trespassed in a place where humans were not meant to be. Their photographic evidence, when developed, showed only blurry, indistinct shapes, and several of their audio recordings contained what sound analysts later identified as acoustic anomalies that didn't match any known natural or mechanical sound. In 2002, a Forest Service biologist conducting a survey of old-growth remnants in the Monongahela National Forest reported finding an unusual arrangement of standing deadwood in a remote area near the original Blackwater camp site. The biologist described how several dead trees had apparently been shaped, while still living, to grow in a specific pattern, a process that would have taken decades of careful manipulation. Within this arrangement of trees, the biologist found a small, weathered box made of an unidentified hardwood. Inside was a journal written in a spidery hand, its pages brittle with age. Most of the text was illegible due to water damage, but one passage could still be read clearly. The trees remember. They hold the old voices inside them. When we cut them, we release what they've kept hidden. I understand now what must be done. The wood must be returned to those it remembers. We must become what we were always meant to be. The biologist submitted the journal to her superiors along with her survey report, but both items were subsequently lost in an office reorganization. When questioned about it years later, she recanted much of her story, claiming she had likely misinterpreted natural formations and perhaps imagined the journal entirely. In a private conversation with a colleague, however, recorded without her knowledge and later discovered among her personal effects after her sudden resignation from the Forest Service, she offered a different account. I didn't just find a journal out there, I found evidence of ongoing activity. The deadwood arrangement wasn't old, some of it had been positioned recently, and I'm certain I was being watched the entire time. I could hear movement in the forest around me, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing visible, just a sense of the trees themselves, shifting in ways they shouldn't have been able to move without wind. She went on to describe finding small wooden carvings placed at regular intervals along her return path to the road, each one more detailed and disturbing than the last, and each one clearly representing her. The final carving, placed just at the forest edge where her vehicle was parked, depicted her in a posture of terror, running from something behind her that was represented only by an abstract pattern of lines that resembled tree branches or perhaps elongated fingers. I left the survey site immediately and didn't report any of this officially, she said in the recording. Some things are better left alone. But I dream about it now, about the trees moving when they shouldn't, about voices speaking from inside the wood. And sometimes when I wake up, there are splinters in my skin that I can't explain, as if something wooden had touched me while I slept. In the years since, occasional reports surface from hikers or hunters who claim to have encountered a tall, gaunt figure moving silently through the most remote parts of the forest. These sightings are typically dismissed by authorities as encounters with other recreational users or possibly with the black bears that inhabit the region. In 2013, however, a group of 4 hikers disappeared from a trail near the Dolly Sods Wilderness, an area not far from the original Blackwater campsite. Despite an extensive search involving multiple agencies and dozens of volunteers, no trace of the missing hikers was found beyond a single backpack containing personal items and a digital camera. When authorities reviewed the camera's memory card, they discovered several photographs taken shortly before the group's disappearance. Most showed typical hiking scenes, landscapes, group shots at scenic overlooks, wildlife glimpsed along the trail. But the final 3 images were different. The first showed what appeared to be a crude structure deep in the forest, barely visible among the trees, a construction of branches and bark that seemed to form a rough archway. The second image, taken from closer to this structure, revealed unusual carvings or growths on the surrounding trees, though the photograph was too blurry to make out specific details. The third and final image was the most disturbing. Taken from inside what appeared to be the structure, looking outward toward the trail, it showed 3 of the 4 hikers standing with their backs to the camera, apparently unaware they were being photographed. Standing among the trees beyond them, barely visible in the forest shadows, was a tall, indistinct figure that seemed to blend into the surrounding vegetation. Its proportions were vaguely human, but distorted, with limbs too long and too angular to belong to a person. Official reports dismissed this figure as a shadow or photographic artifact. The disappearance of the hikers remains officially unsolved, classified as a probable case of disorientation leading to exposure, a not uncommon tragedy in wilderness areas. But some of the search and rescue personnel involved in the operation privately expressed doubts about this explanation, particularly given the proximity to the area associated with the historical Marsh case. One searcher, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper, described finding an area where the forest floor had been recently disturbed. It looked like something had been dragged through the undergrowth, 4 separate trails leading away from the main hiking path, each about the width of a human body. We followed these trails as far as we could, but they all ended abruptly at the bases of large trees. It was as if whatever made those trails had been absorbed into the wood itself. In recent years, interest in the Marsh case has experienced a minor resurgence among paranormal researchers and folklore enthusiasts. Several podcasts and online forums have attempted to compile and analyze the fragmentary historical record, often connecting it to broader patterns of disappearances in wilderness areas across North America. In 2019, an independent filmmaker named Zachary Reynolds attempted to produce a documentary about the woodcutter of Black Rock Ridge. Reynolds and his small crew spent several weeks in the Monongahela National Forest, interviewing locals and attempting to locate sites associated with the historical accounts. According to the production's sound engineer Claire Denton, the project was plagued by equipment failures and unexplained phenomena from the beginning. Our cameras would stop working for no reason when we tried to film certain areas of the forest, she recalled in a podcast interview after Reynolds abandoned the project. Audio recordings would pick up sounds that none of us heard while we were on location, rhythmic tapping, like axe strokes, and sometimes what sounded like whispering in a language none of us recognized. Most disturbing, according to Denton, was an incident that occurred when the crew attempted to camp near the presumed location of the original Blackwater logging camp. We had set up our tents and were sitting around the fire when Zach suddenly went silent in the middle of a sentence. He was staring into the darkness beyond our campsite with this expression of absolute terror. When we asked what was wrong, he just said, "There's someone standing out there watching us." None of the others could see anything, but Reynolds became increasingly agitated, insisting that a tall figure was moving among the trees just beyond the firelight. Eventually, he grabbed a flashlight and walked into the forest despite his crew's protests. According to Denton, they heard him speaking to someone, his voice growing more distressed, before he suddenly screamed and the flashlight went dark. The rest of the crew spent hours searching for Reynolds with their remaining flashlights, eventually calling emergency services when they couldn't find him. He emerged from the forest shortly after dawn, disoriented and with no memory of what had happened after he left the campsite. Reynolds refused to discuss the incident afterward and abruptly canceled the documentary project, returning to Los Angeles and reportedly seeking psychological treatment for what he described to friends as intrusive thoughts about the forest. According to Denton, he left behind all the footage and notes they had collected, telling her to burn it all because some stories shouldn't be told. The footage, which Denton did not destroy but has declined to share publicly, reportedly, includes a strange interview with an elderly resident of Davis who claimed to be a distant relative of one of the men who disappeared from the original Blackwater camp. His clothes were torn and his body was covered in small puncture wounds that doctors later identified as consistent with splinters, as if he had been dragged through rough brush or fallen into a bramble patch. According to this source, whose name Denton withheld, local folklore held that Obadiah Marsh had discovered something in the ancient forest that had been waiting there since before European settlement. The old-timers used to say there were places in these mountains where the trees grew from something other than natural seed, the elderly resident reportedly stated. Places where the earliest settlers found groves that didn't look right, trees growing in patterns that seemed deliberate, with strange formations in the wood itself. The natives avoided these places, said they were where the forest had a mind of its own. According to this account, Marsh had not been the first to disappear into the deep woods, nor would he be the last. The mountains had been taking people for centuries, always those who worked closely with the trees, woodcutters, carpenters, papermakers. They go in human, the resident allegedly said, but what comes out ain't human no more. It just wears the shape of what it used to be, like bark growing over a wound in the wood. Today, the forests of the Monongahela continue to recover from the extensive logging of the past. The scars of industrial exploitation have largely healed, covered by new growth that conceals the stumps and remnants of the virgin forest that once stood there. Tourists hike the trails and photograph the waterfalls, largely unaware of the darker history that lingers in the region's memory. Yet the stories persist. In hunting camps and local taverns, longtime residents still speak in hushed tones about certain areas of the forest where people sometimes go missing. They describe places where the trees grow in unusual patterns, where even GPS devices become unreliable, where one can feel watched by unseen eyes. And some claim that on very still nights, when the wind dies completely and the forest falls silent, you can hear a faint rhythmic sound, not quite speech, not quite song, coming from the deepest parts of the woods. A sound like an axe biting into living wood, followed by whispers in a language no living person understands. In 2022, a University of West Virginia botany student conducting research on old-growth remnants in the Monongahela made a curious discovery. In a remote area rarely visited by hikers, she found a grove of ancient oak trees that appeared to have been deliberately shaped through decades of careful manipulation. Among these trees was one particularly massive specimen that drew her attention due to its unusual growth pattern. Within a hollow section of this tree, visible only from a specific angle, she discovered what appeared to be human remains partially absorbed into the living wood. The bones, which she initially mistook for peculiarly shaped burls or growths, were embedded so thoroughly in the tree's structure that they seemed to have become part of its anatomy, not simply encased by growing wood, but somehow fused with it at a cellular level. The student reported her find to authorities, who investigated the site but were unable to extract the remains without destroying the tree itself. Forensic experts who examined photographs were unable to determine how long the remains had been there, as the usual indicators used for dating decomposition didn't apply to this unprecedented form of preservation. Most disturbing of all, a small metal object found partially embedded in the wood near the remains was identified as a logging company identification tag, issued to Obadiah Marsh in 1906. The official explanation, as recorded in the police report, attributed the discovery to a peculiar but natural phenomenon: a man who died against or inside a tree hollow, whose remains were gradually incorporated into the growing wood over decades. The identification tag was dismissed as a coincidence or possibly a hoax. But the student who made the discovery, in a private journal not intended for public view, recorded a different impression. What I found wasn't a man who died in a tree. It was a man becoming a tree, or perhaps something that had once been a man, returning to what it truly was. The bones weren't being passively engulfed by the wood. They were transforming into wood, the marrow structures visible through fractures, showing clear dendritic patterns identical to those found in branch formations. She went on to describe how, when she first discovered the remains, she had placed her hand against the wood and felt what seemed like a pulse, not the mechanical swaying of a tree in wind, but a rhythmic movement from within the wood itself. And as she stood there, her hand against the ancient oak, she described hearing what sounded like words formed from the creaking of branches, a voice speaking from inside the living wood. It told me its name, she wrote. Not marsh, but something older. Something that had worn the shape of marsh for a time, but had existed in these forests for centuries before him and would continue long after. It spoke of others like it, waiting in the deep woods, in the oldest trees that had survived the loggers' axes. And it told me that they're still waiting, still watching, still drawing in those who come too close to their secret places. The student took a leave of absence from her studies shortly after this incident, and reportedly moved away from West Virginia entirely. Her journal was discovered among personal effects abandoned in her university apartment and subsequently sealed by university officials concerned about potential liability issues related to student mental health. Is Obadiah Marsh still out there in some form, moving through the forests of the Monongahela more than a century after he first arrived? Did he discover some ancient secret hidden in the old-growth trees? Some knowledge that transformed him into something neither fully human nor fully other? Or is his story simply a cautionary tale born from the very real dangers and hardships of life in the early logging industry? The historical record offers no definitive answers. The forests of Appalachia keep their secrets well, buried beneath layers of time and new growth. But those who know the mountains best still warn visitors not to venture alone into certain remote hollows, especially as dusk approaches. And they advise against listening too closely if you hear what sounds like axe strokes coming from areas where no logging is permitted. For in the deep woods of the Monongahela, where the oldest trees still stand, something may yet remain of the man they once called the woodcutter of Black Rock Ridge. Something that remembers what it was to be human, but has become something else entirely. Something that exists in the boundary between flesh and wood, between the world we know and the older, darker world that the ancient forests remember. In 2024, a trail maintenance crew working in a remote section of the Monongahela National Forest made an unsettling discovery. While clearing fallen trees from a seldom-used path, they uncovered what appeared to be an old logger's axe embedded deep in the trunk of a massive oak that had fallen across the trail. The axe was of a style not used since the early 1900s, its metal head severely corroded but still recognizable, the wooden handle long since rotted away. When they attempted to remove the axe from the fallen trunk, several workers reported feeling suddenly ill, experiencing dizziness, disorientation, and what one described as a sensation like splinters moving under my skin. They abandoned the attempt and continued their work. But later that night in their camp, all 4 members of the crew experienced similar disturbing dreams. Visions of walking deep into the forest, of trees that moved without wind, of a tall figure with limbs like branches beckoning them forward. In the morning, they discovered that the youngest member of their crew, a recent forestry school graduate named Michael Harrington, was missing from his tent. His boots and jacket remained, but of Harrington himself there was no sign. A search was organized immediately, but despite extensive efforts by both his colleagues and later professional search and rescue teams, no trace of the young man was ever found. The remaining crew members reported one final disturbing detail. Near the fallen oak where they had discovered the axe, they found a small, intricately carved wooden figure that hadn't been there the previous day. The carving depicted a human form gradually transforming into a tree, the limbs elongating into branches, the torso becoming a trunk, the face still recognizably human, but with features that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The figure bore a striking resemblance to Michael Harrington. The official report classified Harrington's disappearance as missing person, presumed dead from exposure, or wildlife encounter, another tragic statistic in the long history of wilderness disappearances. The carved figure was collected as evidence, but subsequently disappeared from the sheriff's office evidence room under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. For those who know the story of Obadiah Marsh and the woodcutter of Black Rock Ridge, however, Harrington's disappearance fits a pattern stretching back more than a century. a pattern of the forest reclaiming those who come too close to its oldest secrets, of humans being absorbed into something older and stranger than our brief civilization. The Appalachian forests continue their slow recovery from the ravages of industrial logging. The scars heal, new growth covers the stumps of ancient trees, and nature reasserts its dominion over landscapes once stripped bare by human enterprise. But perhaps this apparent healing conceals something else, a patient, deliberate response to human intrusion orchestrated by intelligences far older and more alien than we can comprehend. Perhaps, as local folklore suggests, there are places in these mountains where the boundary between the human and natural worlds grows thin, where what we think of as distinct categories, animal, vegetable, mineral, blend and merge in ways our modern minds struggle to grasp. Places where the forest itself has agency and memory, where the trees remember what they were before humans came with their axes and saws, and where they are slowly, patiently working to become those things again. And perhaps Obadiah Marsh was not a monster, but a messenger, the first to understand what the oldest trees were trying to communicate, the first to surrender his humanity to something more ancient and enduring. Perhaps he walks the forest still, no longer fully human, but not quite something else, a transitional form in an evolutionary process we have only begun to glimpse. So if you find yourself in the deep woods of the Monongahela, far from marked trails and campgrounds, and you hear the rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood where no logger should be working, do not investigate. If you see a tall figure moving with unnatural grace among the trees, do not follow. And if you find a small, intricately carved wooden figure that seems to resemble you with disturbing accuracy, leave it where it lies, and depart those woods without looking back. For the forest is patient, and the oldest trees remember, and what they remember they might someday become again.